Hello and welcome to the American Academy in Berlin's presentation of its Fall Fellows. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and since July 1, I have the privilege and the great honor of being president of the American Academy. Ordinarily, this is one of our most festive occasions and one we would mark with a house full of guests and a lengthy program of speakers here at the Hans Arnold Center. Unfortunately, like everyone else, we've seen our traditions upended by the coronavirus. Not only can we not host the glittering crowd that we would normally have here, but we also find ourselves with only 3 of our Fall Fellows in residence at the Academy. As everyone is well aware, travel restrictions have made it nearly impossible for Americans to get to Germany. We continue to hope that our scholars and writers will arrive in time to salvage most of the semester, but for now we're relying on video links to connect us. Let me say at the outset how grateful I am for our fellows' forbearance in this regard. The American Academy prides itself on bringing the best minds and artists from the United States to Berlin, and I'm pleased to say that we are also bringing people with extraordinary patience and understanding at a time of incredibly difficult circumstances. In a moment, I will turn the proceedings over to Peter Beyer, a member of the Bundestag and currently coordinator for Transatlantic Affairs at the Foreign Office. First, however, I want to thank our trustee, Nina von Malzahn, for her very generous support of this event. And also, I thought, since this is my first event as president, I would briefly introduce myself. I come to the American Academy with a background in government and diplomacy, journalism, academic life, and deep ties to Germany. I began my professional life as a journalist and was exceedingly fortunate to have been dispatched to Germany by the editors of Time magazine in February of 1990 to cover the end of communism, German unification, and the transformation of Europe. As I'm sure most of you recall, this was an extraordinary period and one of the great stories of the century, and I had a front row seat living for much of that time in Berlin, a city I quickly came to love. At the beginning of 1993, I became the Berlin bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. And one of the last events that I covered from that period was a speech by then Ambassador Richard Holbrooke announcing his intention to establish the American Academy in Berlin. He gave that speech on September 9th, 1994. I put down deep roots in Germany during that period. I might mention that at a Thanksgiving potluck dinner in 1992, I met a young German lawyer who would later become my wife. And so I managed to acquire as well a family in Heidelberg, Frankfurt, Berlin, and elsewhere. In late 1994, I accepted a job in Washington, D.C. as a foreign policy speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, and I held that position for more than 3 years. I then migrated within the White House's National Security Council to the directorate dealing with transnational threats, where I held a portfolio dealing with terrorism issues. That too was a formative period for me since it coincided with the rise of Al-Qaeda, and together with a White House colleague, I later wrote a book that grew out of my years at the NSC entitled The Age of Sacred Terror. And I'm pleased to say, if I can add an advertisement for myself, it garnered considerable attention and was awarded the Council on Foreign Relations Prize for the Best Book of the Year. I spent most of the 2000s in the think tank world and eventually returned to European issues when I joined the Brookings Institution and was appointed director of the Center on the U.S. and Europe. I also had the indescribably wonderful luck of coming to the American Academy in 2004 as a Bosch Policy Fellow, and had a fabulous 6 weeks here, which was a period that I and my family continue to cherish. In 2009, President Obama nominated me to be Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department. I was confirmed by the United States Senate in May of 2009 and spent the next 3.5 years as Secretary Hillary Clinton's top counterterrorism advisor and as head of the Counterterrorism Bureau. And I served longer in that position than anyone in the roughly 40 years that it has existed. Finally, in 2013, I moved to Northern New England and ran the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, which is the international affairs hub of Dartmouth College. And for me and my family, this was a wonderful period, far removed from the political whirlwind of Washington. And somehow we managed to find a bit of Deutschtum even in our home village in Vermont, which was also the post-war home of Freya von Moltke, and the village was not very far from the town where Karl Zuckmayer wrote Die Farm in den Grünen Bergen. And I hope that gives you a good sense of where this was. Now, however, there really is important work to do here in Berlin, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to return here to this magnificent city and do it. The coronavirus, which has claimed 200,000 lives in the United States alone, nearly 10,000 in Germany, and close to 1 million worldwide, is only one issue, though obviously the dominating one of the day. Today, my country faces tremendous challenges, from a spate of unprecedented wildfires that have been ignited because of changing climate, to a long overdue reckoning with fundamental issues of racial justice, to an extraordinary partisan division and grave uncertainty over the coming election. We face a hostility to science and learning that I believe ought to shake all civilized individuals. Globally, the problems we face, such as a rising China, climate change, Russian political meddling, and the management of technology giants, are just some of the issues that demand intensive engagement and cooperation. And yet, today, the bilateral relationship between the governments of the United States and Germany is at a low point, with a poisonousness that has not been seen in decades. Against this backdrop, the work of the American Academy is, in my view, more important than ever. We will work hard to bring Americans and Germans together to address these common issues. But just as important as that work is the undertaking of our fellows, whose scholarship and writing and encounters with German counterparts and German audiences are absolutely essential. They're essential for strengthening the bonds between our countries and our societies, for reminding ourselves of our common values and common civilization, and for providing the impetus for political leaders to fix a rift that should have never happened. It is a tall order, but it's a mission that is at the heart of the American Academy. And personally, I can't think of any more rewarding work to take on at this time and in this place. So let me close there, and I am pleased to yield the podium to Peter Beyer. And I should note that Herr Beyer is well suited for the task of presenting our fellows, not only because of his position as coordinator for transatlantic issues, but because of his deep knowledge of the U.S., his experience working with American law firms, and also because he studied at an institution that is one of the well springs of American history, the University of Virginia, which was founded by the author of our Declaration of Independence and our third president, Thomas Jefferson. It is a great pleasure to welcome Peter Beyer.
Dear Daniel, dear friends at the American Academy, and most of all, dear new fellows. My name is Peter Beyer. I am the German government's coordinator for Transatlantic Cooperation. I want to welcome all new fall fellows to Berlin and to the Academy, literally to some of you who have been able to make it here in person, even in these extraordinary times, and virtually, but just as warmly to those of you who have begun your fellowships remotely. I hope that you are all well and healthy, and that you can take full advantage of the amazing possibilities the American Academy has to offer, even under these exceptional circumstances. Most welcome speeches for any new class of fellows at any institution probably begin with an affirmation that it has never been more important to work for cultural exchange than right now. I am sure that not only your immediate predecessors were greeted with the well-meaning words, "Never has your mission been more important than right now," but also the class of 2010, that of 2000, and that of 1990. And it is, of course, always tempting to believe that right now, at this very instant, we are standing at the cusp of a unique moment, and that right now is the time that really matters most, even if a few years later that moment has faded into history's background. So please forgive me for standing here today and saying these words without apology. Thank you for joining the American Academy. There has never been a more important time than right now for your work and for the German-American exchange of ideas in general. Well, there I said it. And the reason that I dare to resurrect that phrase is that I truly believe that we are at a crossroads in transatlantic relations, because two things are happening at the same time. The first one is obvious. The coronavirus crisis has impacted and interrupted all of our lives in countless ways over these past months, and it will certainly continue to do so for quite a while. But although we have all found amazing gadgets and workarounds and learned to use technology better, 2020 has always shown us that a world without actual contact, experienced remotely and on video, is harder to navigate. And I'm afraid that something may become lost in the vital exchange between Germans and American friends. That the day-to-day conversations, exchanges, experiences of the other will strain to regain the level we have enjoyed before this pandemic. That is the first challenge. The second one is, of course, that politically, I hate to say it, we are living in a time of transatlantic estrangement, maybe the most serious one since 1945. The President of the United States has called the European Union a foe and Germany a delinquent. The United States finds itself at once challenged by new geopolitical realities, but also wary of its international commitments, while Europeans, Germans most of all, struggle to face a greater share of international responsibility. And most of all, people increasingly look across the Atlantic and don't see anymore how much unites us. How this unique edifice of democracy, personal freedom, and respect for the individual ties our cultures together in an amazing and beautiful way. Instead, we increasingly focus on our differences and see only what is strange and foreign in each other. I hope that you, the fellows of this amazing program, can discover both. All the important things that Germans and Americans share, combined with their realism, but also the inspiration that comes from the discovery of all that is different. Thank you for making your way across the Atlantic, be it physically or virtually. Because one thing is for sure, you really couldn't do this at a more important time.
Hello from New York. This is Susan Bernofsky. I'm very happy to be joining you. I hope to be able to do so in person and meet all my fellow fellows in the flesh. And thank you so much to all the Academy staff who've been helping us through this complicated situation. So my project for fall 2020 is working on my new translation of Thomas Mann's iconic novel, The Magic Mountain, which, as you probably all know, is the story of a young man who is not ill, who travels to Switzerland just for a visit to a tuberculosis sanatorium and winds up staying. It's a book that's all too relevant, unfortunately, in these COVID-inflected times. Thomas Mann himself lived through the 1918 influenza epidemic. One of his daughters fell ill with it, in fact, recovered, thank God, and he knew what he was writing about when he wrote about illness and the way it impacts our very sense of what it means to exist in this world and be alive. So all of this is swirling around in my head as I think about his book and how my new translation of it will resonate with our modern fears. Thomas Mann decided to bracket the epidemic out of his book, even though he wrote it and was working on it during the epidemic and in the aftermath of it. He ends the book before it starts, an interesting choice, but I feel it ghosting around behind the pages of the story. It's a book set in Switzerland, a place where I've spent a lot of time as a Robert Walser scholar, researcher, biographer, and translator, and I look forward to drawing out that aspect of the story, Thomas Mann's humor. It's already a very interesting deep dive, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to make some solid progress on it in these next few months under the auspices of the Academy. So thank you so much, and I hope to be able to meet you all in person very soon.
Hi, my name is Mosi Secret, and I am this fall's Holtzbrinck Fellow. I would first like to thank the Academy for this wonderful opportunity. We are living in strange times, so I'm all the more grateful for a respite in this inspiring setting where, with the support of the Academy's great staff, I can work and think and create. I work primarily as a journalist and an author in an area most like to call narrative journalism or literary nonfiction. In this age where facts are under attack, and when heated argument on social media or in the opinion pages has emerged as a final defense, much of the work of journalism has become to convince audiences that some facts are right and some facts are wrong, doubling down on the idea that we all share an objective reality. This is vital work, this act of defense, because too many are marshaling so-called facts to deprive others of their humanity. Still, I attempt a different approach. Literary journalism for me becomes the act of recounting events that intrigue me, to create work, feature stories, a book, podcasts, that other human beings bring their subjectivity to, their senses, their emotions, their histories, to draw some meaning from. This is what art does, and all this is a way of saying that creating art is what I aspire to do, to foster a depth of understanding, a warm closeness to the material, that is something akin to an act of love with its inherent contradictions. In my work here, I hope to bring this approach to bear on a curious history that I discovered a few years ago. In the late 1960s and early 70s, as American society was still working to racially integrate its public accommodations, there remained all-white residential private high schools where wealthy white families sent their children. These boarding schools were white families' escape, not just from social conflict, but from the kinds of encounters that would have forced them to question their own ideas and fears about black people. And yet these private boarding schools, known for providing the very best educations, despite their troubled histories, provided inroads to the highest strata of the South. So a group of progressive white philanthropists asked what would happen if these all-white boarding schools were finally integrated, whether elite white students could be cured of their bigoted ideas. The group visited black public schools across the South and eventually black homes, looking for the smartest black students to use for this experiment. Imagine white people from the American South coming into the homes of black families who in many cases had never hosted a white person, telling of life-changing opportunities at faraway schools, the best schools supposedly, which for all the parents knew could house the very seat of racism. Then imagine the group of white philanthropists who in their own minds at least had woken up from the notion that people with dark skin were inferior, and who were so disturbed that others held on to this notion that they figured out a way to try to teach young white people their truth. There was incredible hope, however misguided we may find it now, to lift up a group of people and to change society through the lives and experiences of children. Imagine what it was like being those children. Here at the Academy, I'm taking advantage of the great resources of the library to read broadly about the ideas and movements that gave rise to this effort, and about the ideas and movements that were born from it. It is my hope to find antecedents to the contemporary moment in the United States, as anti-racist ideas are spreading among white Americans like never before following the murder by the police of George Floyd. I would like to reiterate my gratitude for the opportunity to pursue this work, I hope that even in these unusual times, we can get to know each other and exchange ideas.
Hello, I'm Laila Amine, and I'm an associate professor of global Black literatures at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Andrew Mellon Fellow at the Academy this fall. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in residency here. As a comparative literature scholar, I've written about race politics in cultural representation of London and Paris, including a book called Post-Colonial Paris, Fictions of Intimacy in the City of Light. In one of the book chapters that discussed African-American authors Richard Wright, James Baldwin, and William Gardner Smith, I was struck that the novels and short stories about a liberating exile in Europe consistently ended with a chosen return home. Why return to a space of political exclusion, I wondered. My initial interest has now developed into a broader book project on return travel in the African diaspora. At the Academy, I'll be working on a chapter about African-American Back to Africa travelogues by Marita Golden, Sadiya Hartman, and Emily Raboteau. Their disillusionment with the African motherland typifies the roots genre with its tension between imagined and actual return. But unlike other African roots writing, however, these authors are not content with relegating Africa to the mystical past, and they include perspectives of not only diasporic travelers and permanent émigrés, but also immobilized Nigerians, Ghanaians, and Ethiopians. Consciously drawing on the colonial genre of the travelogues, their reflection consider how the diaspora search for sanctuary risk reproducing neo-colonial forms of domination in post-colonies. During the residency, I will also spend time at the Freie Universität in the Audre Lorde archives, which holds recording, photographs, and letters about her relationship with the Afro-German movement. On October 6th, I will be presenting a lecture loosely related to the book I'm working on about James Baldwin's ambivalent encounters with Africa, and I hope to see many of you then.
Hi, I'm Amy Kurzweil. I'm a writer and a cartoonist, and I'm thrilled to be a Berlin Prize Fellow this fall, here or not here in Berlin, to work on my second graphic memoir. So I'll say a bit about my approach to my art form, and then I'll give a brief introduction to my books. The benefit of being a cartoonist is that people don't have to look at you while you talk about your work. They can just look at your work. So I'm going to share some images as I talk. My approach to comics comes from a writer's perspective. I was trained as a writer. I got an MFA in fiction writing, and I came to drawing on my own, mostly because I had an expressive need. I began working on my first book, Flying Couch, as an undergraduate. This first memoir tells the story of 3 generations of women in my family. There's me, the artist, my mother, a psychologist, and my grandmother, a Holocaust survivor who left Warsaw, Poland in 1938 and survived on her own. Parts of my grandmother's story and my emotional life related to that story felt inexpressible in words. I discovered that drawing because the practice is connected to the body, its gestures and involuntary expressions, was deeply connected to my emotional life. In addition to writing graphic books, I also draw cartoons for The New Yorker and other places, and now that I've been drawing for a few years, I think of drawing primarily as a language. And I think about comics as a sort of literary symphony that braids these different languages together in sophisticated ways. Comics also mirror the way my brain preserves experience, fragments of images and snippets of language. This expressive potential of drawing and the dynamic architecture of the form is why I, someone who started as a writer, came to this storytelling practice and why I'm so in love with it. I'm working now on my second graphic memoir, Artificial: A Love Story, which revolves around a decades-old storage unit where my father has been saving documents from the life of his father, a musician and Viennese émigré who escaped the Nazis in 1938 and died of heart disease in 1970, well before I was born. My father is a technologist and inventor who's known for writing prolifically about the future of technology. One of his prophetic dreams is that AI will help us raise the dead, and the salvaged documents from my grandfather have, in fact, been married with artificial language technology to facilitate the building of a chatbot. I've spoken to this chatbot, and the conversation evoked all the stilted, uncanny, longing, sadness, revelation, and confusion that you might expect such an experience to inspire. My book asks, what is the nature of our access to the past? How has it changed as technology has matured? What would it be like to create a virtual person from their remnants? What is a person, anyway? Can I really know my grandfather through his documents, through artificial means? And can I save the people I love through obsessive documentation? The inquiries of my father's project and of my book's investigation bloom into ever greater and older philosophical debates. My goal is not to answer them, but to ground these questions in the intimate details of a human life. Thank you for listening, and I really hope to meet you in a non-virtual space soon.
I'm Matthieu Aikins. I'm a journalist and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and I'm the Axel Springer Fellow this fall at the Academy. And I'm going to be working on my book, which is about the global refugee crisis. It's based on a journey that I made with an Afghan friend of mine in 2016, right at the tail end of a period where almost 1 million people entered Europe, many of them on the little rubber boats that you've seen on the news. So I worked for a number of years. I lived in Kabul, Afghanistan, and I traveled in the region in the Middle East, covering wars in Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Iraq, where I witnessed the human toll that these conflicts have cost and the incredible devastation that has led people to flee for their lives. Today there are about 80 million displaced people worldwide. That's more than there's ever been at any point since World War II. And yet the number of people who get resettled in the West, in developed countries, is actually at an all-time low. Under the current administration in the United States, which was responsible for most refugee resettlements, has actually cut its numbers by 3/4. So for most refugees, if they want to escape the awful situations they're in, they have no choice but to undertake illegal journeys to the West and seek asylum. And that, in essence, is the subject of my book and the journey that my friend and I made. So in addition to working on the narrative account of our journey here, I'm also going to be researching the history and the context of the refugee crisis, links to migration in general, and the way that that's increasing as our world becomes increasingly globalized, both economically and in terms of the challenges we're facing. I mean, climate change, for example, is a planetary problem, and if we can't come up with a planetary solution, there's going to be planetary consequences, certainly. So I do think this is a story that increasingly affects all of our lives and connects us all, certainly, on the planet, and I'm looking forward to working on it this semester.
My name is James N. Green. I'm the Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Professor of Latin American History at Brown University. I specialize in the social, cultural, and political history of Brazil in the 19th and 20th century. I'm sending this message from New York City, where I'm recovering from a fractured tibia, as I anxiously await news of visas so I can join our colleagues in Berlin. I've been working on Brazil since 1973, when I became involved in an international campaign against torture. In 1976, I entered Brazil from the upper reaches of the Amazon. My intentions were to stay for 6 months. I ended up remaining 6 years. During that time, I was actively involved in the movement against the Brazilian dictatorship. I was also the leader of the left wing of the Brazilian LGBTQ movement. Many years later, I am proud to say I was honored by the Brazilian Ministry of Justice during the government of President Dilma Rousseff for my activism. I am still deeply involved in supporting democratic and progressive forces in Brazil, especially since the 2018 election of right-wing former Army Captain Jair Bolsonaro, having founded the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. While at the Academy, I will be working on the project, The Crossroad of Sin and the Collision of Culture, Pleasure, Commerce, and Popular Entertainment in Rio de Janeiro, 1860 to 1930. Most people do not know that Brazil was an empire from 1822 to 1889, nor do they know that Brazil received 7 times more enslaved Africans than did the United States. That is more than 5 million people who survived Middle Passage. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish the institution in 1888 and currently has the largest population of African descendants outside of Africa. The Crossroads of Sin is a social and cultural urban history of Rio de Janeiro, the country's imperial and then republican capital. The project follows transformations in social interactions in public space through an examination of the entertainment and cultural district of the city that surrounded a plaza which holds a monument to Brazil's first emperor, Pedro I. I originally became interested in this site because at the turn of the 20th century, it was also notorious for being the main place for public homosexual sociability, and I touched on this in the first chapter of my first book, Beyond Carnival, Male Homosexuality in 20th Century Brazil. The current project is the first broad social and cultural history of this period, accompanying the processes of the transition from enslaved to free labor and from empire to republic, when there was a large influx of Afro-descendants from the countryside to the capital, as well as tens of thousands of European immigrants moving to Rio de Janeiro as part of a government policy to whiten the nation. This work will examine the complex interactions between elite and popular culture, street vendors and theater people, pederasts and polacas, that is Jewish prostitutes, in this center of cultural and entertainment in order to understand dramatic socioeconomic and political transformations taking place over the course of 70 vital years in the history of the nation. Finally, while in residency in New York and hopefully in Berlin, I will be following the progress of a feature-length film that is based on a biography I wrote with the title, in English, Exile Within Exiles, Herbert Daniel, Gay Brazilian Revolutionary, that is being produced in Brazil. Obrigado. Dankeschön.
My name is Lois Banner. I am an Emerita Professor of History and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California. My project, Ideal Beauty, The Life and Times of Greta Garbo, combines my 2 main interests as a scholar. First, biography, especially of influential women, and second, the histories of gender, sexuality, physical appearance, and feminism. Born in Stockholm in 1905 to a working-class family, Garbo crossed the lines of class, gender, and geography after famed Swedish movie director Marit Stiller discovered her for films and in 1925 brought her to Hollywood, the world's film capital. Within 3 years, she was Hollywood's top-ranked star. I have done most of the research for the book and I'm about halfway through writing it. What new conclusions have I reached? 1, I have realized that the major market for Garbo's films was in Europe, especially in Germany, and mostly among women who responded to her fragility, her power, and her masculinity, which frightened men. I have also explored her cadre of fans, known as the Garbo maniacs, who copied her dress, makeup, hairstyle, and mannerisms. They were mostly homoerotic and homosexual young women and men responding to her homoerotic appeal. 2, I have discovered a deep negativity towards her appearance in the US movie fan magazines, which circulated in the millions of copies. US reporters disliked her tall masculine body with broad shoulders and large hands and feet. They also attacked her for being Swedish with anti-Swedish epithets. They called her dumb, a peasant, flatfoot, and skyscraper. Luella Parsons, dean of the Hollywood columnists, wrote that she was the most ridiculed and attacked star in Hollywood. 3, I have collected and translated her letters to her lesbian lover, Mimi Pollock, a sister student in acting school. They are definitive about Garbo's identity. The letters indicate that the relationship was physical as well as spiritual. Above all, Mimi married a fellow actor in 1926, a man, devastating Garbo. Like Mimi, Garbo did have relationships with men and women during their affair. She was bisexual in behavior. Although she thought of herself as a man, often wore male clothing, and called herself he and the boy. 4. Garbo began her career as a feminist, playing in films that called for the single standard, a slogan that meant equality in sex relations and in marriage, as well as free love, free divorce, and birth control. But she suffered from deep depression and lack of self-confidence. Once her most important film, Queen Christina, made in 1933, was attacked by the censors and judged a failure, she did what the studio wanted. She was taken over by her obsessive drive to make enough money so that she could live the luxurious life of her wealthy friends in Sweden. Garbo began her career wanting to change the world, but the hazards of fame wore her down. She died one of the wealthiest women in the world, bemoaning that she had never married or had children.
A woman arrived alone in Natchez, Mississippi, and took a room in a boarding house at the edge of town. She bore a daughter on the wooden floor of her third-story rented room. The landlady was worried about stains on her feather bed. There was nothing to mark the birth, aside from the woman's love. When the daughter was old enough, the woman took to the road, as she always had. She and her girl traveled to all the great capitals, Memphis, Mobile, Jackson, New Orleans. They were flush sometimes and broke sometimes. They lit the world for one another. The daughter learned more in her first years than most people do in a lifetime. She knew how to restring a guitar, how to do the Suzy Q. She could fall asleep anywhere, even in the rowdiest juke joint in Nashville. She could play the harmonica. She knew how to love ardently and how to live like a lion. The woman told her daughter that love was ferocious and abiding and could not be extinguished, no matter what. She proved this to her child every night. On every stage, in every city, the woman dedicated the first song to her daughter. The girl was always in back, clutching her bottle of cola, watching her mother, her heart in flames. The woman is Duchess Carson. The daughter is her daughter, Lena Carson. My novel, A Violent Woman, is their story. When we meet them in the opening chapters of the novel, the above described years of rambling blues traveling are long behind both of them. Lena has a son of her own and left the South for Philadelphia. Hard-edged, tough-talking Duchess lives in Bonaparte, Alabama, a once thriving black town, now in its death throes. Mother and daughter are estranged, separated by the 1,000 miles between them, their difficult past, and increasingly by Lena's instability. This instability leads to her recruitment into a radical political group called STEP. That group is fictional. However, it is loosely modeled on the extant Philadelphia group, MOVE, who were infamously bombed by the Philadelphia police in 1985. In Berlin, I hope to complete this novel, already in progress. Thank you for listening, and thank you for having me as a part of this marvelous community.
Well, thank you for all those great presentations. And let me just say in closing that the coronavirus has changed our world, but our presentations will go forward, and I genuinely hope that you will join us for our fellows talks, whether online or in person. And we very much look forward to the day when the Hans Arnold Center is back to hosting the crowds that it has for more than 20 years. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.